Okay, so I just quickly gave it a title, Some Considerations on the Pleasures of Wisdom. We were just hearing Paul describe some of the troubles, the challenges that nature has thrown at Asia, especially specifically Thailand, China. And this is something which has been recorded throughout deep history, the fact that nature sometimes kicks our ass. Nature is a beautiful thing, but sometimes it can get violent. And and if we don't discover the laws of nature, we become ever more victims to the whims of these destructive cycles, whether floods, whether droughts. Uh, there's a variety of things, impacts of rocks from space that have resulted in eliminating big chunks of various species that have existed at some time or another that are no longer here, volcanic activity. There's so many things. And so the more we come to discover the laws of nature, the more we can act preventatively, the more we're free to start discovering technologies that allow us to mitigate the destructive effects of said foreseeable things that nature throws at us, that the universe throws at us. So some examples of that, I think that actually making those discoveries, seeing into the future and having the joy of knowing that we saved our lives, our children's lives, by acting accordingly, could be said to be a pleasure. But this is not something that's commonly accepted amongst many schools of philosophy. And this today and the last few weeks, I found myself needing to help clarify amongst the minds of many conservatives how fascism has many facets to it. Especially after World War II, there are a lot of people who tend to, I mean, read my stuff, comment, write to me. They tend to be quite aware of the type of fascism that's expressed itself through the conduit of things like the Liberal Party, the Fabian Party, the Labour parties of England, the Democratic Party, obviously the type of technocracy that has become very difficult to ignore, which is very much obviously based on a highly fascist, centralized system of command and control. And much of that has at its root, at least in its modern incarnation, the thinking of John Maynard Keynes, the figure on the left in this image of two, I don't want to call them gentlemen, two individuals. John Maynard Keynes was obviously a leading Fabian, a eugenicist, somebody who believed very firmly in racial superiority, specifically also world government. Big fan of that, and he acted accordingly. He was very active in his life. He was a mathematician. He believed in the philosophies of Jeremy Bentham, that the ontology of right and wrong are measured in a mixture of utility and pleasure, hedonistic pleasure. And he actually had a little hedonistic calculus for all of his sexual exploits with young underage boys that has been preserved for posterity, just to get a sense of the wiring of this creature's mind. But very influential, and his ideas were targeted to be infiltrated into various parties of the left. This became the conduit in which cybernetics, transhumanism later became infused into many of the Western governments of the world. On the right is a figure who he debated famously in 1932 at the London School of Economics, which is a Fabian Society created school named Friedrich von Hayek. And this is one of the, I guess you could call it founding fathers almost, or one of the godheads of the school known as the Austrian School of Economics. And they were lifelong friends. Not only were they lifelong friends, but they shared a lot of the similar axioms, the similar ideas. They were both lovers of Adam Smith. They were both lovers of Bentham. They were both lovers of the ideas of how to judge pleasure and pain, although one of them focused a little bit more on bottom-up thinking and the other a little bit more on a top-down idea. When encountering an economic crisis, what do? One said, well, you should make sure that you get rid of governments, or that governments eliminate themselves by privatizing everything that might have been built by a government, that they cut the budget everywhere possible, that's creating bureaucracy, and just allow the free markets, meaning the expression of all of the hedonistic impulses of people's desires to buy low, sell dear, and satisfy whatever pleasure that they want to satisfy and avoid pain. That should be unbounded. And then we have to have faith, because it comes down to faith, that self-organizing systems of creative innovation will naturally just come online. That's just going to happen when you just get rid of governments. The other one said no. Keynes said no. You need more centralized government command and control when you're dealing with a crisis, and it's specifically crisis management in both cases. And one, as I said, was infested into the movements of the left. The other one was infested, especially during the Cold War, into the conservative, so-called right-leaning organizations of the world, the Tories in England, especially under Thatcher, the conservatives, especially under Newt Gingrich and Reagan. Well, Reagan himself was a bit of a dupe, but definitely the Heritage Foundation that infiltrated and took control largely of most of the levers of policy action inside of the United States, in tandem with controllers of the Heritage Foundation, which is still very strong today behind things like Project 2025, which is trying to capture and take control of what the oncoming Trump presidency will represent. So this is still a Heritage Foundation operation. It's very big. And again, it's very much tied, when you look at it top down, to members of the Mont Pelerin Society, which itself was created as a Fabian, a right-left convergent program where you had people like Walter Lippmann as a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. It was founded by Friedrich von Hayek, but yet you have Keynesians like Lippmann and many others who are Fabians working with the so-called Austrian school ideologues around von Hayek. Stephen Knight, Frank Knight, the teacher of Milton Friedman, was a member. Ludwig von Mises was an early member. The Otto von Habsburg was a leader of this thing. The same Otto von Habsburg who ran the Pan-Europa, the Pan-European movement. Leading members of the Thurn und Taxis family, the remnants of the still living, the undead Habsburg Empire, were largely in charge of bringing this ideology into especially conservative life, that would then disrupt and overthrow the type of heritage that Republicans in the United States or conservatives in Canada or elsewhere had to people like Abraham Lincoln or William McKinley or Garfield. People who were Republicans, they were very much conservative, but they were also not believers in hedonism or the idea of unbounded free trade ideologically. They were people who had a better moral understanding of what it means to be a human, I would say. That was largely subverted by the infusion of this deregulation, privatize everything idea of freedom that both of these individuals, who both support world government, and Friedrich von Hayek was an advocate of world government and said so at the last chapter of his Road to Serfdom, where he actually calls for a regulatory body to impose the laws of global free trade onto nations that may not want to do it. So he says you need a higher authority, a Leviathan, to impose some common rules onto the system from above. So as much as this guy's celebrated as a bottom-up thinker, he ain't. And so you can sort of see the convergence of this. Now, there's a few things here. Both men, as I mentioned, were both believers in the core axioms of Adam Smith. Adam Smith being sort of the founder of modern free trade theology. I'll call it theology. He was somebody who was directly employed by Lord Shelburne, a man who was largely responsible for the British Empire during the American Revolution and a little bit before that too. Smith wrote a theory, his outline of moral philosophy. He did see himself as a bit of a Newton of moral philosophy, as did Hume later on, as did Bentham. And he wrote of his view of how to judge right and wrong and what should animate the considerations of determining economic value in a society in his theory of moral sentiments. Still very popular, read amongst macro and microeconomic students. You could get it at any university bookshop. So very influential book, very much tied as well to his later Wealth of Nations, where he never actually describes what a nation is or how a nation becomes wealthy. He just simply describes an a priori assumption of this imaginary system where there are these nations, and never deals with how does a nation become wealthy, which is part of the sleight of hand of the magic trick. But anyway, When he was employed to carry out this work, he writes, the administration of the great system of the universe, the care for the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his powers and to the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness and of his family, his friends, his country. But though we are endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greatest part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, love of pleasure, and dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them. Very quickly, what do people think of that so far? Any flaws or assumptions that are maybe a bit weak that you guys might have noticed straight off the bat?
Well, limiting everything to the hunger, thirst, and the passion which unites the two sexes, love of pleasure, etc., leaves out an awful lot of human potential. Straight up,
a ton of, yeah. So it's a bit of a rhetorical question, and you basically just said it. Yeah, so
yeah,
that's exactly it. Yeah, it leaves out a lot of human potential. There's a lot of assumption there, but it formed the basis of another figure. So I'm going to read two figures who represent this vein, both of whom are respected very highly, endorsed by both Keynes and his so-called rival von Hayek. In the form of, people have met this guy before.
Great picture.
Yeah, it's a great. It's a wax molding of the figure of Jeremy Bentham, who in many ways was a prodigy of Lord Shelburne, played a very, very big role in the Masonic subversion of the French Revolution. Cynthia wrote an article going through some of his work and delivered a presentation making mention of Bentham's role in influencing and even writing some of the speeches of some of the Jacobin leaders, including Robespierre and Danton.
Who's the head meant to be, Matthew?
That's Bentham's head. That was part of what Bentham put in his last will and testament, was that his head be embalmed and preserved for eternity.
Oh, Jesus.
So, yeah, I don't know the psychodynamics. I'd be curious to get assessment of that as a psychiatrist at some point, but that's what he wanted. And it was they actually lost his head for a few decades after he died, and I think it was only in like the 1890s or something, where somebody was like looking inside of his torso and found his head embalmed, and somebody just kind of lost track of it, and then they looked at his will and testament, and they were like, oh yeah, he wants it laid out in public, so they did that. So Bentham was a hedonist, the founder of modern utilitarianism, and he developed something called the hedonistic calculus. And in the course of many writings, very, very, I think John Maynard Keynes was probably very influenced by this. Somebody, Jean Sebastien, says he would have loved starring in Futurama with the yes, yeah, that was probably a bit of a precursor there. So he was probably very much a figure that he was a figure who influenced John Maynard Keynes for, I think, obvious reasons that I alluded to earlier. Amongst his hedonistic calculus considerations, he took 7. He noticed that there were 7 categories of consideration when factoring in scientifically hedonism, and how to judge mathematically the best kinds of hedonism to determine what we do or don't do. So there's 7, not 8, not 6, not 5, 7. He made the point. One of the factors is duration, which has sort of a continuum, but of which you can grade it You could punctuate your gradations by some form of scalar metric you impose onto it. Intensity of the pleasure, propinquity, how near is the pleasure to the pleasure receiver, the extent of it, how widely does it cover? I guess do you have like a full body pleasure suit, or is it just like on your shoulder or something, or some other part? Certainty, can it guarantee how free from pain? Oh, sorry, how sure are we that it will come? I don't know if he put a little pun in there or not, but that's a factor. Future, so he brings some time function into the equation, which is consider very, very a lot of consideration there. Purity, how free from pain is it? I mean, you have I guess you could have like an ice cream, vanilla ice cream, and very, very sweet, not a lot of pain, but sometimes you could drink it, eat it really fast and get a little headache. So maybe that would be like a pain factor of 2, pleasure factor of 8. I don't know. Just throwing it out there, right? You guys could probably imagine your own scenarios. Fecundity, how likely to lead to further pleasures? Very, very Promethean here. He's thinking really about the future. Are we doing pleasures that are going to give us more hedonistic pleasures, or maybe will we wear ourselves out by giving into certain kinds? So yeah, very, very thoughtful. It says here, these criteria allow the amount of happiness created by an action to be assessed and calculated in order to judge its moral content. Okay. And he's famous for saying nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Okay, fair enough. All right, that's the thesis. So that's the on one side of the aisle, we have this paradigm. Now let's look at a couple of, I would say, more palatable minds who I think will all probably, I would hope, find a bit more resonance too, but we'll see. First one being my boy, Benjamin, Mr. Franklin, Dr. Franklin. And this is actually a 1771 proposal back before he doubled down on or realized that there was no other way but to go for the American Revolution. But before that, he's putting a lot of effort into trying to find points of redemption within the empire. He had allies, within positions of influence who were not bad people inside of England. And he thought for the longest time that maybe he could build a movement, sort of a reverse deep state, inside of England that could break it out of its imperial behavior and act like a real conduit, a real instrument for legitimate civilization building, moral influence in the world. He thought maybe he could do that. And he tried. You got to give him credit. For decades, he tried really hard. And at one point, so in 1771, he has a plan for a development program for New Zealand. He had a lot of these things, and I just picked one at random that I came across. But there's many proposals that he had for all parts of the colonies of the Americas, of Australia, you name it. But he says here, those who think it their duty to ask bread and other blessings daily from heaven, should they not think it equally a duty to communicate of those blessings when they have received them and show their gratitude to their great benefactor by the only means in their power, promoting the happiness of his other children? How greatly may Englishmen deserve such honor by communicating the knowledge and use, not of corn only, but of all the other enjoyments the earth can produce, and which they are now in possession of. I don't know my Latin, actually. Communiter bona profundere deum est. There it is. To shower good things over all is divine. Many voyages have been undertaken with views of profit or of plunder, or to gratify resentment, to procure some advantage to ourselves, or do some mischief to others. But a voyage is now proposed to visit a distant people on the other side of the globe, not to cheat them, not to rob them, not to seize their lands or enslave their persons, but merely to do them good and enable them, as far as in our power lies, to live as comfortably as ourselves. It seems a laudable wish that all the nations of the earth were connected by a knowledge of each other and a mutual exchange of benefits. But a commercial nation particularly should wish for a general civilization of mankind, since trade is always carried on to much greater extent with people who have the arts and conveniences of life than it can be with naked savages. We may therefore hope in this undertaking to be of some service to our country, as well as to those poor people who, however distant from us, are in truth related to us, and whose interests do in some degree concern everyone who can say homo sum, etc. So very, very different idea of what the empire is or why it is or what its mandate should be than that which was represented by the types of writings of a more Adam Smith or Bentham or Hume, or, you know, you look at even Carlyle, right? Thomas Carlyle, the famous person who dubbed the British Empire, or dubbed the science of economics as the dismal science, because he was a believer in the theories of Malthus and of Bentham, and thus believed also that the science of political economy was dismal because it was based upon ultimately activity which would destroy the lives of most people. But it had to be that way, because if we didn't, they would get overpopulated and maybe a little bit too independent minded, and we couldn't really permit that type of thing to get off the ground. So scientific economists had to think a bit more dismally. Ben Franklin certainly didn't think dismally. He had a different idea of what this political economy was, but most importantly, what this human nature was that was creating political economies and also being shaped in turn by them. The second person on the other side of the aisle, also very, very much of the Benjamin Franklin paradigm, was Moses Mendelson. He wrote a book called Jerusalem, or On Religious Power in Judaism, in 1783, where he wrote that man cannot be happy without beneficence. Beneficence. Thank you. That's a tough one. Man cannot be happy without beneficence, whether it be passive, through receiving it, or active, through extending it. He cannot attain perfection except through mutual assistance, through reciprocity of service, through active and passive connection with his fellow man. So again, just like Bentham, you have a sense of passive and active pleasure that's being discussed here, but it's not of a purely physical nature. It might have physical aspects to it, of course, but there's something more going on that Bentham or Smith have not considered about this philosophy that's being expressed here by Moses Mendelson. We're going to read something by Plato today. And Plato, both Benjamin Franklin and Moses Mendelson, clearly, when you read their writings, were Platonists. Very important that these people are all drawing from, they all were reading and discovering a method of thinking that was made very transparent in the works of Plato, as was Schiller, who we will be reading soon. That's a painting by Raphael of Plato holding the Timaeus. Some considerations when reading the Timaeus or Plato more generally. There's something known as the Platonic solids. We've already, I think most people here have been introduced to them already, have worked through some of the material with some constructive geometry that we've done in the past. There's 5. Plato was asking, and Plato, I don't know if he necessarily discovered the dodecahedron, but he certainly popularized it and investigated and popularized its nature and structure to a greater degree, I think, than anybody else who'd come before him. And probably for thousands of years after him, he probably did the most to make this, to place the emphasis on the importance of these 5 specific polyhedra. The dodecahedron simply being the most, I think, advanced, the most beautiful, you could say in some way, of all, because it partook most clearly in the golden section than the other 4 did. But that being said, they're all related to each other. And Plato was asking, and later on Kepler was asking, and why 5? Why is it that it's impossible to have that 4 should have existed, or 6 or 7? Why was the universe created in such a manner that only 5 could possibly exist? But that once we realize that of all possible polyhedra that are constructible, that only 5 have these characteristics of having, 8 vertices located at equal distances from a center that could be contained within a sphere, and that also could have a smaller sphere contained within each one, touching perfectly the center of the faces of each one, and that thus creates certain proportions that also emerge, right? Especially those proportions get very interesting, as Kepler discovered, who was also advancing and pursuing the theories made clear within the Timaeus dialogue by Plato, that when you nest them in a specific reasonable alignment within each other, you get very, very interesting proportions that have a very important application for astronomical observation. Extremely important. And I would even say for the study of atomic structures too. A certain, I mean, that's a whole other thing. So here's just some of the elements of what you can explore when looking at different angular, I guess you could say, projections of each of those five Platonic solids. When you just take sort of a cross section or an angular cut of each one and just look at them as a projection from a two-dimensional perspective, you start seeing even more very fascinating proportions and symmetries that begin to emerge in all sorts of ways. Very much worth thinking about. So why five? Why not six? Kepler also wrote a beautiful essay, a treatise on the six-sided snowflake. And again, the same question was, why not five-sided or seven-sided? There's infinite possible snowflakes. There's not any two that are exactly identical. It's beautiful. But despite the infinite variability, there's a constancy as well. Why only six sides when forming in nature? Well, what's up with that? What does that tell us maybe about something more universal, right? What does it tell us about our own mind that's contemplating such things? What about, the type of spectrum that one can glean, from the much broader continuum of electromagnetic frequencies that we only began to discover are outside of the visual spectrum? We can see that at least that which is visible can be categorized, quantized in very specific, discrete intervals, where despite having an infinite array of shades between violet all the way to red, you have a specific number of discrete, quantized, what we could identify as separate colors, ranging in bandwidth from anywhere between a little below 400 nanometers to a little bit above 700 nanometers, making almost an octave, but not quite. So what's up with that, right? Why not another arrangement? Why does the inquiring mind find this and not some other arrangement? So before we now go into the Plato's Philebus dialogue on the nature of judging the greatest good, judging good, how do we do it? What's our criteria? Some questions we should hold in mind. I'd like people to just think about this. What does a study of nature have to do with the power of communicating transformative ideas or creating transformative art? We are going to be getting into, after all, Schiller, a great artist, poet, playwright. So also this is going to be a very big factor we're going to encounter in a lot of Schiller's writings on beauty, on art, on the sublime. So keep that in mind. Can a study of beauty truly make people better, or is it designed simply to give us pleasure alone? Is beauty or truth or goodness infinitely relative, or are there discoverable universals? And can these things be explored separately or only together, right? Can we just have a one book where somebody devotes a couple of years to the study of truth, and another book where somebody devotes just a study to goodness, and another book devoted only to a study of beauty? Hey, or is that absurd? Is that a Cartesian fallacy? And last I'd throw in there would be, and people can have their own questions too, don't limit yourself to these questions. Are all pleasures equal, or can some pleasures run contrary to nature? How do we know? How do we judge such things? So, big questions. Keep them in mind as we review, as we read through the dialogue. We're going to stop, talk, ask questions about what's happening in the dialogue. I'll end here with an excerpt from John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. It's a beautiful Grecian urn. I think it's gorgeous, featuring some activity that was, going on in the days of ancient Greece. And Keats, upon looking at this thing, probably in some British museum, was on the one hand probably a little annoyed that the British were stealing stealing all this art from different parts of the world. But on the other hand, he was also very moved by it, and he wrote an ode on the Grecian urn. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of poetry. And at the very end of it, he ends it in the most famous line ever, I think, in poetry that I know of, where he says, "When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe. Thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." And it ends. It's a much longer poem. I'm going to link it in the description box for people who want to read the whole beautiful Keats poem. Very important poem. But that ends my formal introductory remarks before we go into the Philebus dialogue.